Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Parag Khanna, Senior Research Fellow in the Center on Asia and Globalization here at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. We're accustomed to wide-ranging discussions, global topics, very deep and far-sighted issues being covered here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. But surely, the title of today's event is inspiring in its ambition: a cloud for global good. Very much a mix of the technological and the humanitarian, and as I said, a very ambitious topic for us to discuss today. And we have no better cast to discuss these issues today than we have with us, and that includes Ms. Toni Townes-Whitley, the Corporate Vice President, the Worldwide Public Sector for the Microsoft Corporation. She is responsible for a global team of 2,000 sales professionals working with the government and private institutions. The official mandate of this division is to enable and transform smart cities of the future, to help government officials take advantage of technologies to deliver higher quality citizen services at lower cost. Prior to joining Microsoft, Ms. Townes-Whitley was president of CGI Federal, and she's also held management positions at the Unisys Corporation. She's a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, and was a former Peace Corps volunteer in Central Africa, and continues to support the Peace Corps and other very important civic institutions in the United States. And we are also very lucky to be joined for the second time in a month, I might add, by Minister for Social and Family Development, Mr. Chuan-Jin. For those of you who were at the Lee Kuan Yew School's 12th anniversary event, he really impressed everyone again with his fluency across all of the major policy areas that Singapore is facing, and that will no doubt again be the case today. Mr. Chuan-Jin has been the Minister for Social and Family Development since April of 2015. He is leading the efforts to build a more caring Singaporean society and a better home for families and children. Previously, he was Minister of Manpower, where he worked on creating better jobs and raising incomes for Singaporeans and strengthening retirement planning. He has been the Senior Minister of State for National Development. He is the Member of Parliament for my very own Marine Parade constituency on the east coast of Singapore. He very importantly served in the Singapore Armed Forces for nearly 24 years, and he led the SAF's relief efforts in Aceh in Indonesia in the aftermath of the 2004 Indonesian tsunami. He is currently also the president of the Singapore National Olympic Council. He studied at the London School of Economics, has a master's degree in defense studies from the King's College of London, and of course, very importantly, he was in the inaugural class of master's degree graduates in public management from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So I'm sure you agree we have a very distinguished gathering of, leading a cohort of speakers this morning to discuss a cloud for public good. And so without further ado, I'd like to invite Ms. Townes-Whitley up to the stage to give her remarks, after which the Minister will speak, and then they will join me on stage. I'll give a few reactions, we'll have a Q&A, and we'll open up to the audience for your questions as well. So please prepare your thoughts. Thank you so much. Ms. Townes-Whitley.
It is fantastic to be back at school. This is my first trip to Singapore with Microsoft, and this probably is the capstone of this visit, is this conversation around, if you will, technology for good, social good, civic tech, public cloud for good in the world. All these different conversations really come around, do we understand the impact of technology and transformation, and are we purposeful about that impact in driving towards societal good? And it's a conversation I've been waiting to have these lines come together. For those of you who've been studying and working in this area, been waiting for this conversation to come together as it has, and we are at an unprecedented stage right now. We're in school, so let's make this as interactive as possible. What you see in front of you are two pictures of Broadway and East 23rd Street of New York, 1905, 1925. What is the distinction between the two pictures? 20-year difference, but what do you see as the difference in the picture? Thank you, cars. On the left, you see a horse-driven society with 100,000 jobs in New York dedicated to feeding, managing that one aspect of transportation being horse-drawn. With 25% of the GDP of the country around the agricultural needs for horses. That was 1905. 20 years later, you see lined up at the same corner, Broadway and East 23rd, a set of cars. And so it's a visual discussion about what do we mean when we talk about a fourth industrial revolution. It's important as leaders for us to go back and understand the differences between the first, second, and third revolutions. Obviously, the first around steam and power. The second around electricity and what that drove. And the third around data processing, all to apply to mass production. And now we find ourselves in this fourth industrial revolution. And in this fourth industrial revolution, we are blurring the lines between the physical and the digital. And it's creating a new dialogue, and one that I would argue the people in this room, the people in this wonderful university, are core to this dialogue. So what does it mean for Microsoft to talk about its technology, its cloud, in terms of social good? Why does a company, one of the largest software companies in the world, $93 billion in revenue, 120,000 people, why are we talking about this now? It's a fair question, and it's one that I'd like to tease out for the next few minutes. So let's talk first about the opportunity, and we'll see about this fourth industrial revolution. What does the opportunity look like? I don't know how many of you saw the recent article about the Columbia, two Microsoft scientists, data scientists, and the Columbia professor around pancreatic cancer. Did anybody see that article about what's happening right now just with our Bing search capability? So recently was announced the ability to detect pancreatic cancer before it is diagnosed. How do you get there? You get there because we now have an understanding that through digital transformation, this fourth industrial revolution, we've got an engine, and the new engine is called cloud. Cloud technologies. We have fuel for that engine, which is called data. And we're using those with a combustion-like pattern to drive with machine learning, with algorithms that take an unprecedented amount of data and can analyze it and detect patterns in ways that we never could. And through the Bing data, we've been able to detect patterns to identify one of the most deadly diseases. 3% survival rate beyond 5 years, 3%. And now just recently announced the ability to detect that disease before it is diagnosed currently in the medical field. That's what the power of this digital transformation means. It's the power of scale, of analytics, deep analytics, of machine learning. It's the power of a mixed reality between the physical and the digital realm to understand patterns, to detect trends, and to create new opportunities that have not existed. It's the power that underpins new technologies that I know you've heard about and or are comfortable with or are working with around artificial intelligence, around genomics, around machine learning, around what we call mixed reality. All of these are coming as a result, again, back to the engine and the fuel. So the first picture I showed, horse and car. I ask you to use that analogy throughout our conversation to say, where are we now? A recent McKinsey report also commented on how fast this transformation is occurring. I think you've heard terms of this is at 10 times the pace of what we've had and 300 times the scale of what we saw in the first industrial revolution. So a company like Microsoft that has boots on the ground in 90 plus countries but serves 191 countries around the globe, this is a company that's got to be part of this discussion. We're a company that's part of the discussion of future technologies, and it's a company that has to take on this new discussion around the impact of those technologies. Another example, I know you all have heard the conversation around TV white space. We know right now that 60% of the world is not participating in the digital economy, that roughly 4 billion people on the planet do not have the benefit that exists here in this room and in this region and in Singapore particularly. We know that. And so we're spending a lot of time and investment in Microsoft to understand how do we connect more of the planet through TV white space, through a spectrum that we can use to connect very remote areas that have had no connectivity. And this is just an example of how we've done that, both in the Philippines and all over this region on TV white space. Again, a new technology powered engine, cloud, fuel, data, and all forms of emerging technology coming from those. So this is around a new dialogue for companies like Microsoft and for, quite frankly, public policy, government, technologists, social scientists. We're all now becoming part of this digital transformation. We used to just count how many people were getting comp sci degrees, and that somehow told us what our technology sector looked like. That's no longer. Because whatever industry you're working, you are a technologist at some level. That is the new expectation for the digital economy, and that's what we're finding. But with opportunity, we know there come challenges. And it's important for us to be aware of those challenges. There's what we call the power and paradox of the digital transformation. You know, I was just at the UN week before last. And at that point, President Obama had asked many companies to come together in a call to action to address the 65 million refugees and displaced persons around the world. And it was in that conversation with him that I talked to him about the power of digital transformation, but the paradox that exists, that it can be used for good and it can have some negative impacts. And I would hope that this audience is ready to have some of that discussion. The power and the paradox. For refugees, here's an example. We're doing all forms of digital literacy. We're doing all forms of training, using Skype Translator to help refugees speak in foreign languages when they land into a new country. All kinds of wonderful work is being done by ourselves and others in our industry. And yet, as much as we know that digital transformation transcends borders, we also know that borders matter, because we can do all of that work and refugees can still find themselves stateless and without the ability to work. So until policy and law catches up with technology, we've still got a pretty substantive gap. And that's where we find the paradox of our conversation today. I love this quote from our CEO. Our customers and society expect us to maximize the value of technology while also preserving the values that are timeless. This is the expectation of a company like Microsoft. Our mission statement is to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. I don't know if many of you have a remit of 7.4 billion people. Please let me know if that's in the scope of your job responsibility, but it is mine, and it's all of my colleagues. When you have a mission statement that reflects empowerment for the planet, you can't have a conversation about technology without talking about impact. You can't have a conversation about digital transformation without talking about displacing thousands and millions of individuals, and what does that mean for learning going forward. We can't have a conversation about digital transformation and not realize that the very technology we're introducing to improve the world can also take down the world, as we've seen in areas of cybersecurity, human trafficking, and all other forms of negative activity. I mentioned our mission because it's important for you to understand how that mission is now changing the way we go to market and how companies like ours are starting to change even the way we design technology for society, which is new and it's unique. One example. I think most of you all are aware of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were approved last year by 193 leaders. These are the goals that are going to carry us to 2030. These are the 17 most pressing issues facing the planet that were approved by country leaders last year. Microsoft has a set of many solutions, industries that we serve. But we've taken our strategy and said, let's apply our strategy and our solutions to those goals. So interestingly enough, I don't just represent a foundation or corporate social responsibility. I have a P&L responsibility. This is the business side of Microsoft saying, we're going to go to market against these goals. In fact, we identified 8 that we thought we could go very directly to market against 8 of the 17. So all of our solutions, our engineering, our philanthropic efforts, our research are now driving towards these goals. It's my hope at some point in the future that we will be held accountable against these types of goals. That's what you want technology companies to start to show in how they go to market. In fact, when I mention solutions, that's an eye chart for most of you in the room, but it shows you that we go to market, particularly around government, public safety and national security, health, education, and driving the next generation of cities. And what you see beneath that are a set of solutions. We have mapped those solutions to the goals I showed you previously. That is where we're going, and that's what you should hold us accountable for. Are the solutions we're building driving towards a better planet? Is the way that we're building those solutions sustainable with green energy in the right way? Are we protecting the public good as we build data centers and capabilities around the world? Are we in fact aware of displacement and the effect of digital transformation? You should ask companies like Microsoft what they're doing. And this is the dialogue we should have. You know, I think about the UNDP work that we've done in Nepal after the amazing 2 sets of earthquakes in Nepal, where we partnered immediately with the UN Development Program and put in a debris management system. This was actually taking people who were victims of the actual crisis and giving them a job to go and assess how much debris through a cloud-based application. And then we paid them. It was actually formal work that was paid for that was to the service of the UN. And this was done within days of the actual disaster. And you can see some of the examples there. 3,000 emergency helpers, able to rebuild their own community with cloud-based applications immediately right after the disaster. This is when we talk about the use of cloud for good. You know, it's interesting. We have 3 words that we think about when we think about technologies: trusted, inclusive, and responsible. And interestingly enough, today, at the same time we're launching this conversation, the CEO of Microsoft and the President and Chief Legal Officer, Brad Smith, are in Europe having the exact same conversation, and they're launching a new book. And you guys, it's hot off the press. Yes, it is. I actually have it. It is physical, and there are real words in it. So those who were wondering if it was a prop, I want you to know there are words in it, and there's obviously a digital version of it. It's called A Cloud for Global Good. Now, this is the first book of its kind, and I tell you as an economist, I was trained as an economist in a public policy school. I went to technology. It was the path I took. I am so excited to see a real dialogue about the policy and legal reform that is necessary to catch up with the technology that we all know exists today. This is a book that has 78 recommendations across 15 policy areas. Let me give you an example. Policy areas around personal privacy, cross-border data flows, what access to data the government should and should not have. What does inclusiveness look like? What does accessibility look like? These are formal policy recommendations in 15 areas with examples of a Microsoft position about how policymakers have got to move forward in addressing these very tough trade-offs between personal privacy and public safety. Those kinds of trade-offs have not been talked about in open forum, not as strongly as they should have. And so this is exciting for us to have this kind of dialogue. I invite you to find this, A Cloud for Global Good, and we'll make sure we're going to leave as much as we can in terms of some copies. But this is right off the press, and this is the same day that this is being announced in Europe. And I will be traveling to other parts of the world over the next few weeks talking about a cloud for good. But whether it's cloud technology or even broader emerging technologies, this is the conversation that Microsoft is having, and we want to have it with the people in this room. All around the world. We want to talk about civic tech. We want to talk about sustainable energy. We want to talk about protecting the power grid. We also want to say, you know what, we're aware, we're purposeful, we're aware that the data indicates in the next 20 years, if digital transformation occurs as we expect, for every 1 job that is created in the digital world, 4 jobs for a man, traditional jobs, will be eliminated. But for every 1 job created, 20 jobs will be eliminated for a woman. Why? Because women are disproportionately in the labor categories that will be affected through digital transformation. So left to our own devices, if we as a community aren't purposeful in how we do digital transformation, we will have a very digitally literate group of people. It'll be a small group, and that divide will get even worse. This is the kind of conversation we have to have. We have to be purposeful, responsible, inclusive, and we have to win your trust in our technology and in our position, in our principles as a company, that we are aware of the impact that can be negative and we are working towards an impact that's positive. Let me end here with just one or two last comments, and then I'd like to just show you a small video. One of the things that is the reason why I joined Microsoft, 18 months ago I left Washington, D.C. and traveled to the other Washington. I found out there were 2 in the U.S. And I traveled to Seattle with my husband. I left 5 children, I left 2 grandchildren, I left parents, and I left a very needy Cocker Spaniel. And I did that. I had just been promoted in another job, to be honest. And I did that because of this conversation right here. Because I've been waiting to see when the world was going to come together on this discussion, and Microsoft was at the forefront. I joined this company and took on the worldwide public sector role and circumnavigate the globe and talk to government leaders and talk to our engineers and talk to accessibility representatives and talk to women and girls and different groups. And I do that because there's a dialogue that's happening around this 4th industrial revolution that is personal to me, and it is incredibly passionate to Microsoft. That's why I did it. This next conversation, I'm a 7th generation teacher. So before coming into technology, I was a teacher. And I want you to see the impact of what this means for Microsoft and for education. Let me just roll
What
this.
did we start talking about yesterday, guys?
St. Patrick's Day!
I
am a resource special education teacher. I target groups of students who need intervention for either reading, language arts, or math. These are kids that struggle every day. And to watch them grow and learn and have those aha moments
Oh, now I get it.
is so rewarding to me, and it just makes my heart soar. We have ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia. I have a student who reads on a 3rd grade level, but then I have a student who reads on a kindergarten level, and I have to find a way to bridge the gap. We've been using OneNote since the beginning of this school year. Even in this short amount of time that we've had it, it's been completely transformational. When we first started using OneNote, I thought, okay, this is gonna take us a while to get going, and we're gonna have to learn how to use it. 3 days. It took them 3 days to master OneNote. I have a dyslexic student who's also dysgraphic. He still reads on a kindergarten level. He's 10 years old, he's still learning sight words, and he would tell me all the time that he was stupid. When we started this school year, he read 4 words per minute. For the longest time, I struggled with how to help him. And when we got the learning tools with the immersive reader, he went to 22 words per minute. I never thought in one calendar school year that we would even get into double digits. And he's at 22 words per minute, and he stayed there. For my students especially, it's really transformed their educational experience. I don't know what next year will look like. I don't know what our possibilities are, because in my wildest dreams, I never thought this would be what it is. Sky's the limit.
The sky's the limit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was indeed inspiring, and you really covered a lot of ground there, the industry agenda and accomplishments and objectives, public sector as well as social. And I would just add, because you gave the example of the research on cancer, I think Microsoft Research was cited, and that's a website that people should know, because I've certainly been a consumer of Microsoft Research work on data analytics for quite a while, and social analytics, if it will. It's a field that maybe wouldn't exist in its form if it weren't for what Microsoft Research does. So there's excellent work going on in that regard. You did, of course, talk as well about inclusiveness, and that's absolutely the mandate of Minister Chuan-Jin. So without further ado, Minister, please.
Very good afternoon. Thank you very much for taking time to come here, and thank you for the excellent presentation. I think even in Singapore, I think technology, we're all very familiar with technology here and how it's being applied. I'll just cite you one story, for example. Halfway through his business admin course, Gerald Bartholomew, his vision deteriorated to a point where he could not read more than 3 minutes at a go. He learned to use the Windows accessibility feature, and this is a plug for Microsoft, I suppose. You wrote my speech, right, Jessica? Magnifier, and it enabled him to use the computer more efficiently. And today he's age 47. He works in a clinic. In fact, his work requires a lot of precision in terms of reading labels. And of course, in clinics, I think it's very important to read the labels correctly. And Gerald will be tapping on the assistive technology fund to purchase an eBot Pro that allows him to zoom in and out of documents, the device text-to-speech function, the portability, the connectivity, and that's where I think cloud would also come in many ways, and the connection to his mobile phone are all features that enhance his work performance. I think what I really would like to focus on and talk about is really about the application, certainly in the Singapore's context. Now, stories like this, as you've watched on the video just now, it's happening today. There will be even more dramatic stories, I think, in the years to come. But there are also negative stories. In the picture that you saw, the Flatiron, I think apart from the people losing their jobs, the horses lost their jobs as well. And I think we all know of stories of people being laid off because of technology. And people are being unemployed, and some perhaps even permanently so if they do not reskill. And so with every advance in technology, it's both good and bad. And I think in itself it's neutral, but how you apply it, you can take it to the extremes, and there will be both the positives and negatives. At the end of it is really the choices you need to make and how do you balance it. But the stories actually are also not new in many ways. I think when we entered, well, not we, but when mankind entered the first industrial revolution and then proceeded to the second and then to the third, the same things happened. I think we were all grappling with serious issues. Society was transformed in ways which I think people of the day could not fathom. I'm sure they were going through a lot of angst-filled discussions like this, perhaps. Restructuring took place in all, if not in all sectors. People lost their jobs, but then new jobs were created as well. And debates about the value of change, the impact on humankind, it raged. In fact, today we're also presently going through the throes of wondering about the ills and drawbacks of globalization. And it's a phenomenon that's fueled by technological advances that brings the world together in an ever tighter fashion as the days go by. So vast exciting opportunities are emerging, as did risk before. But as pointed out, I think what could arguably be different is that the magnitude and the pace of change is significantly different. But I'm sure the people of the day also felt that as they transited from one revolution to the other, the magnitude and scale was completely different. So imagine if you were at the cusp of the second revolution and say, oh, this is nothing like what we had before. And similarly, I think that same conversation when we entered the third revolution. But the world adapted, even as it changed. So would this fourth revolution be different? Is it going to be fundamentally different? Well, it certainly will bring us to a different level, and I'm not even sure whether we can all completely fathom where we're going to go. One wonders also if this would be that era where artificial intelligence would really come knocking on the door and challenge our sense of what it means to be human. Potentially, I don't know. You watch the movies, it seems like it's going to happen, but your guess is as good as mine, but the possibilities are there. But I would make a few observations and perhaps address the issue, not so much from a global perspective, perhaps, but perhaps bring it down to our context here in terms of what we're doing for Singapore in trying to applying some of these ideas in a very real and practical ways, in terms of our smart nation approach, in terms of trying to build better lives for all. So a couple of things. First, let's start off really with what is really the purpose of this whole endeavor. I think it's always useful to just remind ourselves about the purpose, because technology doesn't transform for its own sake. It has to ultimately make a very real difference. And so I lifted this from our smartnation.sg website, so please check that out too. And they're really interesting. In the process of preparing for this, technology is really not quite my area of coverage, but it's really quite insightful. I mean, we know of the things that are being done, but when you actually go through the details, it's actually quite exhaustive. So firstly, a smart nation is one where people are empowered by technology to lead meaningful and fulfilled lives. Secondly, a smart nation harnesses the power of networks, data, and infocom technologies to improve living, create economic opportunity, and build a closer community. And I'm sure as the years go by, new words, new themes, new ideas will be added to this, but the end object, I think, largely would remain the same. And thirdly, a smart nation is built not by government, but by all of us, citizens, companies, agencies. And that's what we have articulated as what we are trying to achieve here in Singapore with the whole Smart Nation initiative. The second question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we organize ourselves? Because we need to figure out how do we allocate resources, how do we begin to reorganize government, how do we try to set in place the steps that are needed to realize this vision. So at the government level, for example, we have set up the Smart Nation Program Office. We have reorganized and established GovTech and the Information and Media Development Agency, or IMDA, as well as the Cybersecurity Agency, CSA. Then flowing from that, there will also be sub-structures that are being set up. For example, in my ministry, we have SG Enable, where we seek to promote awareness on such use of assistive technology through TechAble at an enabling village. If you've not been to an enabling village, I do encourage you to take a look. TechAble is an assistive technology and training center. Students and working adults with disabilities, now they will receive assessment and advice on devices that would help them in school, at work, and at home. Clients who require financial assistance can also apply for the Assistive Technology Fund, which can provide up to 90% subsidies for the purchase of AT devices, subject to means testing and some limits. But this is how these things begin to trickle down in very practical ways, and it's really important to look at these details. Additionally, the Enabling Village offers a space to prototype new service models and programs for persons with disabilities. And it brings together, and this is really important, it brings together different partners to achieve the greater collaborative and collective impact. In fact, I think earlier in June, participants of Microsoft Philanthropy's inaugural summit in Asia, they took part in a learning journey at the Enabling Village. And there were really good ideas about enabling opportunities were being exchanged. And following the summit, I understand that Microsoft India has expressed a tremendous amount of interest and keen to visit the Enabling Village to learn more and to see how much of that can be replicated from where they come from. Now, at the service delivery end, when we are looking at disbursing welfare and help, MSF has launched the Social Service Net, or SSNet, in 2015. Basically, it's an integrated information sharing and case management system that will link MSF and other government and VWO help agencies. It would seem quite straightforward, and some may even wonder, why haven't you done it in the first place? But actually, just to pool information together, I think it's a very big step. I think this will allow efficiency to be gained, quality of case management, so the recipients don't have to keep repeating the story. It might seem like a low-hanging fruit, but trust me, I think you work with governments or large structures, it's not always very easy. But to pull it together, and how do you then begin to tap on the data that's available, that's really quite critical. But I'll touch a bit on privacy and how far do you really want to go with this information mining that would make a lot of difference at both ends of the spectrum. In other ministries, obviously, there will also be policies, guidelines that will be needed to facilitate growth, development, and application. So, for example, to allow fintech to take off, MAS is basically working on a regulatory sandbox which will allow space for innovation and to allow for risk in a more controlled environment. Failure is an inevitable part of the innovation process, but when you associate failure with the financial sector, that's kind of scary. But we know that we cannot remove all risk without trying, without failing. You're not going to know where the boundaries are. So I think MAS is quite clear, and we are quite clear, that you need to allow for those things to happen. But then can you create a safe space for those experiments to take place? Can you allow a safe space where failures can happen without bringing down the financial system, which would be quite catastrophic? So this is something that they've done the public consultation. They've been looking at it in detail, and there's something that they'll be announcing soon in terms of how we envisage that space to grow. Telemedicine, for example, is evolving today. In fact, I was working with Satacom Health in my own ward, where they're trying out a pilot in my constituency. Basically, Individuals with chronic medical conditions, for example, hypertension, diabetes, they will carry with them a device back home. And they will be provided with the bandwidth, to access the net. And basically, you do your blood tests, you can check your blood sugar content, you check your blood pressure, and this will automatically be transmitted back to the SATA ComHealth Central Monitoring System, where doctors, nurses will be tracking your data. And then the medical professional, without you necessarily coming back to the clinic, will be tracking your data points, and that they'll give you a call to prompt you if you find that it gives some concern and that perhaps you should be taking a medicine, or if it begins to deteriorate and to begin to pick a trend, then perhaps let's activate and get you in. Because for many of these chronic diseases, you will realize that for many people, they actually come in way too late. This has a tremendous impact on the quality of life. And I would suggest, even in terms of managing healthcare costs, which I think is going to be a very acute issue that all governments need to deal with, especially with longevity. I think by dealing with issues early, I think it allows you not only just to ensure the better quality of life for your people, but I think it probably allows you to manage healthcare costs in a much more effective manner as well. And the idea really is to nip issues in the bud. And this is particularly critical for us, and I think many countries, because come 2030, 1 in 5 Singaporeans will be age 65 and above. That's 900 over 1,000 Singaporeans of that age. I think we can leverage on technology to help us manage better. So even wearable devices, which can track your health status, or even simply just to track where you are, because we know that dementia is increasing, and a lot of bandwidth. Let's not even talk about the angst that families have to confront when elder members go missing, but resources just to be put in place to search for missing elderly folks. Just wearable devices, that's something that I think could easily happen, and it could easily happen today. And of course, a key program for us is Skills Future, which is really aimed at ensuring that individuals can weather the changes that we know will happen. We want to make sure that they stay relevant through lifelong learning and when reskilling is required, and to provide subsidies, to provide platforms for them to undergo this. I think a recent survey, I think today's article, I think yesterday, was talking about how many of us actually have not fully embraced this. It's a fairly new concept. Many of us will go to school, study whatever we need to study, and we think that that will last us for a lifetime, but it isn't going to happen. So it's a whole mindset change, it's a whole cultural shift. So Skills Future is going to be part of that journey, because if we don't grapple with those changes and reskill and retool, when we become irrelevant, and that's where I think unemployment is going to happen, and we will be left behind by technology. And that is already happening to some, and we must make sure that that doesn't happen to the majority of the people, if not all. So, and of course, wide range of apps to enhance quality of life, transport, traffic, and even housing estates. In Singapore, of course, as you know, we provide public housing on a very large scale, and so we're trying out in Yuhua to see how much of these smart technologies can be embedded even in the building of an entire housing estate as well. And how can that facilitate in terms of providing for better living conditions for our people. But beyond the structures and organization, I think it's also the ecosystem. You need to set in place the climate for this to happen. So we need to, for example, a key part of it is to have a vibrant startup ecosystem. Some of you will be familiar with BASH, which is Build Amazing Startups Here. It's set up by it's actually quite a good acronym. It's set up by Infocom Investments Private Limited. You know, it is Singapore's biggest integrated startup space. It seeks to bring together the tech community across the entire value chain. Ideation, acceleration, incubation, expansion, all under one roof. And Infocom Investments itself was set up, it's owned by government, basically to build and invest in Singapore's global Infocom technology startups. And the JTC launchpad at OneNote, where a lot of this is taking place, at Block 71, Block 73, Block 79, it's really beginning to thrive. And it's really quite exciting. And of course, business-friendly policies, which Singapore is well known for, I think it remains really important, because I think we're also entering into new areas where we need to perhaps look at new policies to attract companies to come here, companies to stay here, to invest, to experiment, to try. Because we need to incentivize, even as the market will drive a lot of things, but I think government has a part to play as well to try to encourage that to happen. So EDB, Spring, IIPL, etc., they are all working together to see how this space ought to be grown. And of course, R&D institutes like A-Star, they need to get on the act, and of course, the education system. We need to then begin to look at the curriculum. How do we expose our students to topics like coding, programming? IT is going to be invariably part of all our lives. So even though you might be an art student, you might be studying literature and the rest, but you need to figure out where IT fits into the overall scheme of things. So we need to look at a curriculum. We need to look at how students can have the opportunity to not just be exposed to IT, but to play around with it, to apply it, to build things, so that they have a better sense of how these technology doesn't just exist for its own sake, but how it applies in real life. A new O-level subject on computing next year, for example, will teach secondary school students skills such as programming and algorithm. Another example will be the Smart Nation Fellowship Program. Basically, what it seeks to do is to draw in top local and overseas data scientists, technologists, and engineers, and to join the government. Short stints, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months perhaps, on meaningful projects for public good. So you tap on the global talent pool. Come in, try. We are a laboratory to try out all these new technologies. Some will work, some won't work, it doesn't matter. But every step that we go forward, I think we will learn new things. Some things will take off. And that's a really exciting space. And I think that's where government also need to relook at the way we employ our talent. How do we organize ourselves from a HR perspective in order to harness this? So we need to groom technologists. How do we employ engineers? I think that's one big theme, because we realize that without perhaps actively realizing it, a lot of young people are drawn to the financial sector, services sector, and you're beginning to lose some of the engineering talents that you need, because ultimately engineers need to build things, design things. So this is something that we're actively looking at to see how we can create that vibrant, dynamic climate. But the climate in terms of being more accepting of failures, risk-taking, pushing boundaries, those things don't always coexist with government structures. Now, it's easy, you've been watching the presidential debate. I mean, I learned a new term, the word salad. You toss a lot of words, but it's making things happen, without mentioning names. But you want to build a vibrant, dynamic climate, but we all intuitively know you need to do it. But how do you actually create that? So building the structures, organizing it, I wouldn't say that's low-hanging fruits, but that's something you can imagine, you can wrap your heads around. But to really build a culture where you can encourage your civil servants, your people, to really experiment in really a fail-safe environment, how do you actually do that? And you need to undo a lot of mindsets that takes place. And that's something that we need to grapple with and see how we can try to embrace that. But lastly, I think managing risk in this brave new world. I think we all know that there are risks. Vulnerability, there's redundancy, there's intrusiveness. On vulnerability, I think as we become more integrated, as lines of codes proliferate in areas which didn't used to have lines of code, that same source of greatest strength, I think, will be the same source of our greatest vulnerability. Because the fridge, traditionally, they don't have the chips there. And how do you then put that in place? And then are the lines of code secure? Because that becomes a pathway through which you go in and perhaps you can go into other systems. So you've got to deal with that. So for us, structurally, so CSA was set up to oversee cybersecurity. And then in terms of technical standards, Spring, working together with IDA and IT Standards Committee to set those technical standards. Now, redundancy is something that I think we're all quite aware of. Skills Future, like I mentioned, aims to help mitigate that the possibility of people being made redundant. Technology, I think certainly we all know that I think it will uplift. Because it allows all of us to access information, regardless of how rich you are, how connected you are in terms of the social networks. The lack of wealth really need not restrict us anymore. The asymmetry of information, I think, will become less pronounced. It has become less pronounced. But will people still get left behind? For the price of a small smart device, access to power, bandwidth, good reception, I think any person on earth can access the grid like anybody else. But you see, just from the presentation earlier, in Singapore, we take that for granted. But we forget that quite a lot of people out there in the world don't have access to that. But it's something that can be done, and certainly here in Singapore, I think we do want to strengthen it where we can. Hence, our home access program. So even though in Singapore where penetration is high, there are people who find it difficult. Those who are lower income, who may have less access. So a home access program, basically what it does, it's by IDA and the National Council of Social Service, basically provides a subsidized rate of home broadband and basic devices for internet access. And the program will benefit households. How about the elderly? So there's a new PC Plus program. I think that's for students and persons with disabilities from low-income families. For the elderly, the People's Association and IDA, we have a Seniors for Smart Nation program where the elderly can select from 25 courses at community centers on various subjects like learning how to use Facebook. I imagine the same modules for Instagram, Snapchat, or whatever it may be. Surfing the internet, basic things for elderly, but it allows them to connect with the rest of the world. Where previously they didn't have access. Today you see old folks who previously didn't interact. Some of them are beginning they really take to Facebook and they are connecting with old friends, and suddenly that isolation, of course, we know that physical isolation, the emotional, psychological connection with people is vitally important in person, but next best to it, perhaps actually being connected via social media. I think that allows individuals to break out of the confines of their homes, where they may be confined to today. And that has, I think, huge ramification. And skills future credit can be used to pay for those courses too. Intrusiveness, privacy. I think as big data grows even bigger, I think the question is, how intrusive will we be? Privacy issues, so we have to enact laws, right? So the privacy, use PDA, what PDPA, it's keep on using it, Personal Data Protection Act. Well, it tries to provide a sense of security and confidence. But I can tell you, does it get in the way? So from my perspective, right, as a Minister for Social and Family Development, looking at helping those who are vulnerable, I believe that we should go upstream. Why wait till someone falls before you activate the social safety nets? Now, so imagine this. Someone having difficulties paying for his bills. So he didn't pay his electricity bills, doesn't pay PUB, doesn't pay Sing Power, doesn't pay the town council fees at the kindergarten. But these are data points that could be picked up. And then as I begin to correlate, I could begin to have indicators that show that they are in some sort of financial distress. Do we want the government or someone to be tracking your payment patterns in order for us? Because you can see the possibilities, right? It allows us to detect problems early, but at the same time, it is rather intrusive and even more of a nanny state than perhaps one might be prepared for. One of the cases I deal with, for example, in divorce maintenance cases, which gives, I think, some women no end of grief, because men who are supposed to pay maintenance drag their feet. They can afford to pay, they're earning, but they drag their feet and they come with all sorts of reasons, and it is really distressful. But actually, if I have access to their IRAS data, if I have access to their CPF data, I know exactly what you're earning. If you are not paying, I will throw you to jail because the laws allow me to do that. Today, the woman is being in distress. She needs to think about civil, engaging a lawyer to deal with the issues. But again, the question is, how far can we go? And how far do we want to go? And those are questions that we need to ask ourselves. And of course, laws, insurance, when we have driverless cars that are going to come online, insurance, liability issues, there are a whole range of public policy issues that we need to grapple with. And they are not easy because they are new. I think many of us have not encountered it before, and how do you actually begin to wrap your head around this? So let me conclude. Basically, where we are today, should ideas be leading technology, or should technology be really shaping ideas? And I think it's probably both, because I think technology offers us so much that we can't even begin to even imagine what we could do with it. So I think technology would drive a lot of things, but we will be entering uncharted territories. So we have to grapple with the real practical public policy issues of choice. Because up to now, we're just talking about all these grand ideas, but then, as we say in Singapore, money no enough. You need to figure out where the budget is going to come from, the competing needs. You need to manage costs, especially with proliferation. Cost is going to go up, and especially when you're at the cutting edge of technology, development costs will be factored in, and it's not cheap. So how do we prioritize? How do we allocate? Can our organizations evolve protocols and processes, as I mentioned earlier, to deal with these advances? So as you can see, there's lots to do, and certainly there are a lot of unknowns. But clearly, change we must, and embrace it we will. And I think run we shall. So there's certainly exciting times ahead. So thank you very much.